Hello, everybody, and welcome here to the Wine with Jimmy channel. Thank you for stopping by. This is all about the wonderful world of wine here. If you are an enthusiastic amateur, you will find plenty of information here useful for broadening your knowledge and your enjoyment of wine. If you are studying the world of wine, even more helpful, as the resources here on this channel are really, really useful for your studies to make you understand and gain more confidence to go into your examinations. We follow key text and key syllabus here at Wine with Jimmy of major wine qualifications. Welcome to a series here on Australia for the WSET Level 4 Diploma. We are in Series 3 here, looking at the state of Victoria, nestled in the southern section of Australia, and it's an 8-parter. We have the first 3 parts being available as free content, parts 4 through to 8 only available to those of you who subscribe to my e-learning platform. Okay, let's rock and roll, talking about all things Yarra Valley, but we'll do an introduction to Victoria to begin with. If you do have any comments or questions, please do get in touch. It'd be lovely to hear from you about your experiences with Australian wine, what your preferences are, and maybe your journey to the country. Okay, let's look at the introduction to begin with to Victoria. So really to give location and geography some importance. Now, to the east of South Australia, which is to the left of your map there, the state of Victoria has been split into 6 smaller zones covering a wide range of conditions. The Port Phillip zone, which is in dark green on your map, is along the southern coast around the state capital of Melbourne. It's home to some of Australia's mainland's most coolest vineyards. To the west and east, parts of Western Victoria, identified there in lime green, Central Victoria there in kind of a pinky purple, and northeastern Victoria in a blue, are influenced by the large topography, which is the Great Dividing Range. The hottest areas are found in the northwest Victoria zone, which sits off to this map to the north, and that runs along the border of New South Wales. This includes the Murray-Darling region. Gippsland on the other side, going right down to the coast, also in lime green, you'll see that to the southeastern part of your map. This runs along the coast of Victoria and experiences variable conditions resulting from weather systems from both the north and the west. Victoria produces less wine from fewer hectares of vineyards than New South Wales. So in terms of total production, it actually sits third. It's the third largest state. So that's behind South Australia first, then New South Wales, and then Victoria. If you put aside the Murray-Darling Basin wines, the mass production that tends to be up there, Victorian wine production is actually more focused on quality rather than quantity, with many, many small producers. So therefore, the average wine prices tend to be just a little bit higher. So to talk about Victoria history is to talk about Yarra Valley history. Vines were first planted in the Yarra Valley in the 1830s, and the vineyard area across Victoria from the back of this expanded rapidly throughout the rest of the 19th century. There was significant success in the export markets, but then Phylloxera strikes Europe, and production declines to almost nothing by the 1930s, 100 years on. Partly due to the revival of European vineyards, partly due to economic depression, but also the local consumer preference at that time for fortified wine production. The arrival of Phylloxera arrived around just before the turn of the century, around 1900, and it devastated some of the regions here. The region was born again in the 1960s and 70s when Reg Egan from the Wanturna estate replanted the first vines, and then our pictured gentleman just there, Dr. Bailey Carrodus, who was a scientist, produced the region's first commercial wines more than 50 years long. Bailey was an innovator who became known for his uniquely elegant wines and bold vineyard decisions. He planted unirrigated, low-yielding vines at a time when irrigation and high yields were the norm. He embraced the Yarra Valley's cool climate and really focused on those leaner wine styles in an age really when warm climate wine regions and big, powerful wines were in the spotlight. Bailey was one of the many pioneers who breathed life back into the region through that fearless innovation and experimentation. Now, Phylloxera still remains a threat, and there have been a number of outbreaks in recent years, most notably in the Yarra Valley as recent as 2019. Part of the Yarra Valley is now classified as a Phylloxera infested zone. That's what you see here in purple on your map. That means it contains vineyards that are known to be or have been infested by Phylloxera. Other regions, such as Mornington Peninsula, are classified as being at risk, a little bit like almost at risk from extinction in terms of species around the world. So quarantine and biosecurity laws are taken very seriously in this area. Now, due to the phylloxera risk, all new vineyards are being planted on phylloxera-resistant rootstock, and replanting programs are underway on many of the older vineyards. On the positive sense, this means it gives the producers the opportunity to consider which varieties are best suited to their vineyards and to consumer preference. Let's focus on where we're looking at. We're going to the Port Phillip zone, there highlighted in green, the only highlight on your map. This is around Melbourne City and the coast of Port Phillip Bay. Proximity to the sea here moderates the climate and cools the growing season as you would expect. In certain areas, altitude can also have an effect, certainly when you think about areas like the Upper Yarra Valley. The conditions are suitable for early ripening varieties such as Pinot Noir and, of course, Chardonnay. Grape varieties, these ones, have become very, very important in kind of the cultural identity of wines from many of these areas. But some of the sites across Port Phillip Zone are warm enough to ripen Cabernet Sauvignon and Shiraz. Let's focus in more on the Yarra Valley. So this is inland and to the northeast of Melbourne. It's a diverse region with vineyards covering around 2,837 hectares. So about a third of what I was just about to state. The outline there in red is the Yarra Valley. So it sits below the Upper Goulburn, it sits above Gippsland, and it has Port Phillip and Melbourne sitting to its west. Many of the vineyards are located here in the lower Yarra Valley area, around places such as Yering, for example. Yering and Coldstream. So let's talk about the climate of the Yarra Valley. It's cold to moderate and maritime. In cold years here, certainly in more inland areas, frost can be a hazard, certainly inland and on the valley floor. That's due to the cold air sinking from the hills above. The annual rainfall is significant. Check it out on your table to the bottom left. The average from the 1960s to the 1990s per year was about 1,200 millimetres, and in the last 30 years, about 1,100 millimetres. What falls in the growing season was in the 1960s to the 1990s about 580, now about 550 millimetres. So we're looking at about a 6 to 7% decrease. It is one of the wettest regions in Australia. There's often high humidity, and fungal disease is certainly an issue. The picture here in the background is of Hoddles Creek Estate Vineyards, identified by the red dot on your map to the top left. If you have been following on from my South Australian series, you'll see that the mean temperature in January is actually much lower than we find in South Australia, most of the regions. And it has got 1.2 degrees warmer in the last 30 years compared to the 30 years before that. So it is an area that is warming up quite significantly by about 5%. More on the climate and topography. Now, that box, by the way, is where most of the vineyards are located, hence why I've highlighted it. But there is considerable variation in the climate due to altitude. Vineyards range from about 50 to 350 metres. The vineyards are split into areas called the lower Yarra Valley, sitting towards the kind of north of your map, and then the upper Yarra Valley, which is in the south. The lower altitude sites are around the lower Yarra Valley, so around Tuolangi, Coldstream, as we mentioned earlier. The upper Yarra Valley is more cooler, has higher altitude sites. The slopes of the valley tend to be relatively gentle, but they do provide a range of different microclimatic conditions. For your information, Scoresby here, sitting towards the southwest, is actually in Melbourne. A little bit on the geology. The Yarra Valley's diverse topography is then translated into its geology. There are two prominent and radically different soils. The traditional grape growing areas on the north side, highlighted in the box, feature soils of grey to grey-brown in colour soils. They are loamy sands, clay loam, with sometimes red-brown clay subsoils, often filled with rock. This is derived from the ancient sandstone of the Great Dividing Range. It's somewhat acidic and low in fertility, but generally well drained. The other major soil type is the much younger, immensely deep, fertile and well-drained, vivid red volcanic soil are found around the areas Seville of Hoddles Creek and elsewhere on the southern side. That is where you would find the actual words such as the Upper Yarra Valley on your map. So what key grape varieties are we finding here? Now, black grape varieties account for about 2/3 of the harvested fruit weight in 2023, with Pinot Noir at about 43% of the region's tonnage, by far the leading grape variety. Yarra Valley Pinot Noir is generally light to medium-bodied. The lighter wines will come from the higher, cooler vineyards, where you will find quite a lot of innovation around things like whole bunch fermentations. That will enhance the kind of perfume and really bright red fruits such as strawberry, cherry, and sometimes plum. The medium-bodied expressions will come from the warmer sites, certainly more towards the standard northern section, which is the lower Yarra Valley. A mixture of new and used oak vessels tend to be used for maturation, whilst producers are increasingly favouring larger formats like elsewhere in the world, so occasionally using foudre over barrique. Wines are typically good to outstanding, and they are mid to premium priced. Do look out for also Yarra Valley Shiraz. It's only about sort of 1 out of 10 bottles here. Medium bodied, but with lovely fresh blackberry, raspberry, plum, and very notable rotundan, so black pepper and spice. You'll often find a little bit of herbal character too, enhanced by the whole bunch fermentation. Look out for Cabernet Sauvignon, which is medium-bodied, also with herbal elements, about 6% of production. You'll find both of those, the Shiraz and the Cabernet, sometimes having oak, considerable aging potential, and Cabernet may be blended with Merlot too. Chardonnay is important to talk about. It's just over a quarter of the tonnage. Typically, you'll find white peach, grapefruit, and melon. This region was certainly the pioneers for moving away from the rather powerful, overdone style of Chardonnay. And that is to make much leaner expressions, picking the fruit early, using old oak, and avoiding malolactic conversion. But we find those leaner styles or delicate styles still being produced towards more medium expressions. Both of those will use new and used oak for fermentation and maturation, but with a tendency to lean towards larger formats. Often a high degree of solids are used in fermentation, especially when you've got heavy deposits post-fermentation, so gross lees, to give a reductive note from the reductive sulfur compounds. Malolactic conversion is still often avoided here, and the wines typically are good to outstanding and mid to premium priced. Okay, for the first time, let's have a look at the Google Earth video on this series. We'll first of all outline the region we're going to focus on this series, which is Victoria, of course. First of all, though, I will be just showing you the main zones before going into the region called the Yarra Valley. So there's Victoria. We'll look at the Port Phillip Bay zone around Melbourne to begin with, including places like Yarra and Mornington Peninsula and Geelong. And this has some of the coolest vineyards in Victoria. Then we've got the northeast Victoria zone, the central Victoria zone, and the western Victoria zone. These are all located along the Great Dividing Range, which is a very significant mountain range located in Australia. So there in blue is northeast Victoria, in green central Victoria, famed for places like Bendigo, for example, and then finally western Victoria, where you find the Pyrenees and Grampians. On the other side, in yellow, we'll look at Gippsland, which is quite a large expanse area, but only home to around 50 wineries, very small family focused in Gippsland. The big mountain range I mentioned is the Great Dividing Range, which stretches for about 3,500 kilometers. It's the fifth longest land-based mountain range in the world. So it does have a big part to play, certainly on a lot of the wine regions in these zones. Let's have a look at Melbourne, and then, of course, very close to Melbourne, located to the east and slightly to the north, is the Yarra Valley. The Yarra Valley is a region of around 2,800 hectares. It's cool to moderate climate with a growing season rainfall of 555 and a total rainfall of 1,100 millimeters. It's quite high humidity and fungal disease. Vineyards lie from around 50 meters close to Melbourne up to about 350. We're focusing there at the upper Yarra, which is a cooler area, and now we're focusing more towards the lower Yarra, which is warmer. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay account for about 71% of the total production of the Yarra Valley. Okay, well, that brings me to a conclusion looking at the introduction to Victoria and the Yarra Valley. Please do join me for another important area, Mornington Crescent. No, I'm just joking. Mornington Peninsula. That is another free video. If you wish to watch it, you can follow on just now. Part 3 is also free content, but parts 4 through to 8 are only available to those of you who subscribe to my e-learning platform. You see at the bottom, that's over at www.winewithjimmy.com. Once again, any comments and questions, please do get in touch. It'd be good to hear from you. What are your experiences with Yarra Valley wines? Do you like Victoria? Do you like the Pinot Noirs, the Chardonnays? What are your favourite producers? If you find yourself in the UK, come and say hello for a glass or bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Goodbye.